In spirit of Monday morning session, which I was unable to attend. From what I heard, there was a very spirited discussion, and I'd also be happy to continue that. So please speak up with any questions, complaints, issues. I'm trying, so again, this is coming from perhaps a rather pure theoretical computer science background and trying to engage with the biologists here. So yeah, please speak up. Okay, so evolvability. We've got these functions in our body that are genetic. The mechanisms of life, the biochemical mechanisms of life, are computing, and the question is, where did they come from? In some sense, they seem to be well adapted to the current environment. How did they become well adapted to the current environment? How, when the environment changes, will they continue to adapt? And so think of these complicated protein networks where each connection here is not just a connection, but actually some sort of function representing that the concentration of protein Z should be expressed to satisfy some certain equation, some certain relation between it and the concentrations of other things. How do these connections get perfectly evolved for their task? Or if not perfectly evolved, how do they get reasonably evolved? How do they do anything useful at all? This picture, as you can see, at first glance, looks like everything is connected to everything. So there's an incredibly complicated thing going on here. And how did it arise? How will it continue to adapt as conditions change? So evolvability is the combination of concerns from two different areas: evolution, biological evolution, and PAC learning, probably approximately correct learning, a model of machine learning from computer science. Okay, so on Monday, we saw 4 talks about this. So first was the introduction, trying to motivate this, and also give you some impossibility results, which, from what I heard, were controversial. Next, Vitaly Feldman gave the Boolean model for evolvability and showed how you could emulate a very broad class of machine learning algorithms from within this model. Varun looked at functions with short representations because in biology, perhaps, the concentration of a certain protein maybe only depends on the concentrations of a few other proteins. So maybe there's short representations for each particular component of what's happening in life. So can we quickly evolve functions that are better than you might otherwise expect? And Elaine talked about what chemical kinetics tells us about the kinds of functions, the classes of functions that we should be concerned with modeling here. Okay, so because Monday was a long way away, I'll go back and try and review the model. And again, please bring your questions forward. So why is evolution like learning? Why is this a reasonable metaphor? And what can this teach us about evolution, or perhaps about learning? So just to start out, what is sort of the standard learning model? So we have some function that we're trying to train. We want to train this to be a better function. And we've got some distribution of examples that we present the function. And we try and ask the function, do something with this example. And if it does the right thing, we try to, depending on what it does, we try to train it to be better. So as an example that you guys have all probably seen in some form, so labeling images. So perhaps the distribution is some distribution of images. So you have some database with a whole bunch of images, and you're trying to train a function to label these images. So you have some function, it's given an image of a cat, and it returns something. It guesses it's a dog. So then what happens? Well, there's some performance evaluation. So you have given it a picture of a cat, your function has said dog, you compare the desired answer to the actual answer, and depending upon what happens, you try to update your function to be a little bit smarter about how it labels things. So this is machine learning. So nature also plays this game. Evolution plays this game. Everyone plays this game as part of going through life. So where the function that we are trying to improve is expressed by your DNA. Your DNA encodes this function, but also chemically enforces this function. Your DNA chemically enforces how to respond to different concentrations of proteins around it. Nature gives you examples, and your DNA encodes responses to these examples. So instead of, in the top example, presenting your function with a picture of a cat, in life, nature throws a physical cat at you. A cat appears in front of you. And biochemically, your DNA enforces some response to this cat. When a cat appears in front of you, what does your DNA encode that you do? So perhaps the chemically encoded response is that you start sweating. Is this a good response? Is this a bad response? Again, nature always evaluates your performance. We are always constantly being evaluated, with the end result being, do we survive and reproduce, or do we die off? There's no way to avoid this. Nature is throwing examples at us. Our DNA is chemically enforcing relations that respond to these. And then our responses are being evaluated. Is there a clean model that captures all the aspects of this? No, but we can aim for something which at least tries to capture some of the flavor of this. So again, the more concrete version that we'll try to model is things like the concentration of chemicals X and Y in your environment is 0.73 and 0.49. What concentration of enzyme Z will you produce? This is encoded in your DNA if we knew how to read DNA in this sense. So the question is, how does this relation between X, Y, and Z evolve? Okay? It's very important, both for the machine learning setting and for evolution, to quantify this over a very big class of distributions. And also, of course, over a large class of functions. So there's considerable mystery about what both the distribution of, say, ecology is, and also about what the functionality that DNA should perform is. So the computer science approach to when we don't know the exact nature of something, we make a broad class of things and say, look, let's just pretend it's an unknown example from this class.
There is one other difference. I don't think that mapping is complete, because in the nature, the DNA of that organism, of its relatives and so on, feeds back to the nature. So it's not, here you have a one-dimensional flow of information, and that's the machine learning case. And in biology, it's not.
Right. Yes, so there's many kinds of questions you can ask of a model. The question which we're more aiming at is, what kinds of behaviors can arise in this setting? And
so it is not true that it doesn't arise in machine learning. It certainly arises when you trade stocks, you influence the market. Where you're trading is just a simpler first approximation to what things are.
Trading is an example where it also breaks down, yes.
Is it going to be crucial here that we're asking like what concentration of enzyme Z to produce, and not like how do I make enzyme Z better?
how do I make enzyme Z better?
Adjust the protein to make it work.
Yeah. So in some sense, it's hard to come up with a quantitative model of how proteins map to functionality. So we are using this instead. So again, I'm not aiming to capture everything in the world. I'm not even aiming to capture the richness of everything in the world. I'm aiming to capture a problem that we don't understand how to solve. And that I think it's actually rather embarrassing that we don't know how to solve this. So I mean, okay, just a general metaphor. So supposing you observe some phenomenon that you can't quite explain. So I'm not sure how many of you go hiking in the mountains around Yosemite, but anytime you see a lake, you see fish in the lake. How did those fish get in the lake? So you see a phenomenon like this, and you immediately come up with some guess. Well, okay, maybe the fish swim upstream. And then, okay, well, immediately you notice some things which kind of confound this theory, that, okay, I've found a waterfall. How did the fish jump up the waterfall? And well, okay, maybe the first waterfall you find is only this tall. And if you watch for long enough, you'll eventually see these fish, amazingly enough, jumping up this waterfall. But then further on in your day, maybe you'll find a waterfall that's 100 feet tall, and then how do the fish get up that waterfall? And so suddenly you need a more sophisticated explanation. Maybe further back in time, 10 million years ago, the waterfall was smaller, and the fish jumped up there, and they've been living up there for the last 10 million years. And the fact that the mechanism that you know about, that fish can jump up small waterfalls, breaks down for this large waterfall, immediately gives you insight that, and lets you predict some kind of strange event that you haven't seen before that may have happened in the distant past. So again, you can do all of this. You can infer the existence of a time when the waterfall was shorter without having modeled the entire guts of the fish. We're just modeling a certain part of the fish, realizing that our model is insufficient to explain what's happening, and then saying that we need a new explanation for this case. So I'm not trying to model all of nature. I'm just saying that if you try and simplify things to the point where instead of modeling an entire fish, you just say, look, I don't think a fish can jump 10 feet in the air. Then this already gives you plenty of insight into things which can and can't have happened. Okay? Okay, yeah, so I think I want to make one more detour right now, just to, okay, so the, no, okay, I'll make this detour in a few minutes. Sorry, is there a clock? Okay. So, okay, let me just review the model, which we've seen Monday and we'll see again. Okay, right, so, sorry, last thing here is Darwinian evolution is like machine learning, but machine learning in some sense lets you do anything to update this function that you want. Given the data, given your performance evaluation, machine learning is just what can we do to make this function better? And evolution is not unrestricted in this way. Evolution has some restrictions. Exactly what are these restrictions is, of course, up for debate. But one kind of restriction you could add is that the feedback to DNA is survival or death. The DNA doesn't do explicit computations on your life experiences. Or at least if it does, this is a unusual and this is an unusual mechanism, and the main mechanism of life isn't the DNA computing on your entire life experiences. There isn't a pipeline from your visual cortex to your DNA so that it'll figure out, based on what you've seen, how to edit your DNA for your progeny, right? So whatever learning can do, we might hope that evolution can do. Whatever learning can't do, evolution can't possibly do, because evolution is a restricted subset of learning. You can't do arbitrary you can't do arbitrary operations to update your DNA. You can do some certain restriction of these. Okay, so let me introduce the model, which is a variant of what we've seen on Monday, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the philosophy. Okay, so nature has a distribution in n-dimensional space. You can think of each of these dimensions as being the concentration of some protein that's in our cellular environment. And nature also has in mind, perhaps, for every particular combination of n of these proteins that we care about, or n of these chemicals in our environment that we care about, it describes for each of the m proteins that we are going to produce what the best concentration of them to produce is. So why m and not 1? Well, because we can. So you can say just, focusing on one protein, what's the ideal concentration of this one protein? But there are many proteins that you want to produce, and maybe we want to evolve them in parallel. So, a glib example is, supposing I want to learn to walk, I don't want to evolve left leg part of walking separately from right leg part of walking. Walking only works if I have two legs working together. So having multiple outputs and trying to evolve them together seems like it's something that we need to at least do. And a creature's DNA somehow encodes and enforces this function that maps input concentrations of chemicals into expression levels of m different proteins. Okay, so for each creature, we're going to model life as the following game. So nature has a distribution of input examples, and we take several, over the course of our lifetime, we're presented with several examples. Nature presents us with several examples. And then the creature responds to these examples by expressing proteins. So given a sample X, concentrations of all these different chemicals in our environment, our DNA encodes some hypothesis h of x. The ideal response, not that we know this, not that anyone happens to know the ideal response, but there is some ideal response. We can call this f of x. And for the moment, we can say, just as a slightly simplifying assumption, that the performance of our creature we're going to model as just how far is h of x from f of x. Again, these are vectors in high-dimensional space, so take the vector distance, and this is a rating of the creature. So for each creature we can rate it, and then Darwin says there's survival of the fittest. And there are many ways to implement this. As it turns out, provably many of them don't matter in this context. But the easiest way is just the best single creature C survives. And then finally, the crucial thing which we need to figure out is how to produce the next generation of offspring from the parent. And then this process repeats. So we have the following crucial definition of evolvability in the real numbered setting. So a class of functions, f, is evolvable if there exists a mutation algorithm such that for all distributions and all possible ideal functions, ideal responses to the environment, functions in this class, a near-optimal hypothesis H will be found efficiently with high probability. So this is saying this triple defined by the class of functions capital F, the distributions D, hopefully all distributions, and I guess the third thing which you might include here is just that we're using a quadratic loss function. Yeah?
Polynomial in what?
Yeah, so polynomial in all of the parameters involved. So in this case, it would...
And you have a continuum.
Right, so discretize the real numbers to whatever position you want, and then in terms of that, sorry, yeah?
Am I missing something that you did not define best? Is it the expected over the expected difference between H and F?
Yes. Yeah, so take some number of samples, and then compute this, and take the average of this over the samples.
Yeah, okay. It's not defined.
So yes, an empirical best, not a...
Sure.
So you don't even need to take an expectation. So expectation is in some sense cheating. Expectation is saying, if we ran the creature for an infinite number of lifetimes, how good would it be? But all you need to do is take some fixed number of samples corresponding to its actual lifetime and see in its actual lifetimes which creatures did best. Okay? So
I mean, the fact that it's quadratic, the penalty, does that matter much?
yeah. So again, the kinds of results we're asking are, so for a triple, which consists of a class F of functions, a class D of distributions, and a loss function L, which at the moment is quadratic. This thing is evolvable. Okay?
But
But
if
this
I
is
replace
yes.
it with quadratic
It
by
doesn't
something
matter.
else, does that change the answer or change whether you can prove it? Or need, I mean...
Sure. So certainly it makes it harder to prove. And I believe actually people were complaining on Monday that this was too restrictive, but you're saying, oh no, you don't care now.
Well, I don't know.
Vitaly was saying that it does change the answer, actually.
Sure. So
Does it change the answer or whether you can prove it?
The answer. It moves some functions, some class of functions from polynomial to non-polynomial, depending on whether it's
yeah.
quadratic or linear.
So all three of these things set up a landscape.
No,
okay?
I understand, yeah.
Right, and they interact in a complicated way. These three things interact in a complicated way through this process. To set up a landscape.
I was just asking what was known or guessed about loosening up this prediction.
No, okay. Towards the end of the talk, I'll definitely talk about loosening this up. But
well, who do you attribute this loss function to the nature or to the person who's trying to learn the hypothesis?
Sorry, you mean the evolving creature?
No, so the loss function.
Yeah.
I mean, in evolution, who decides that? Does
So
the
it's
nature?
nature. Yeah.
And so would things change if you allow the existence of some loss function, which could be a Turing machine, which is efficient on the outputs?
Yes. So I'm saying, in general, we want to ask for what triples will you reach near optimal behavior in a reasonable amount of time? Okay, so if you're interested in a certain class of L, then yes, this is a fair question to ask. Okay, so this is completely within the scope of this slide. Okay, so for what triples FDL are you going to reach near optimal performance guaranteed for any function chosen from this, for any distribution chosen from this, and for your loss function L? So I'm asking this in this kind of generality. There are many different ways that you can make this problem more precise.
And if I ask the question about within this class, does a typical function in this, or typical df and h in this class, is that evolvable rather than the worst case?
Right. So let me get to that in one moment. There's a question here.
Yeah. Do you not gain anything with sexual reproduction or crossover?
Yes. So you gain something, but you don't gain the difference between polynomial versus non-polynomial. Okay. So I just wanted to address something here, sort of philosophical thing. So I'm. Okay. So the result which I'm going to present is. That low-degree polynomials are evolvable, okay? Which includes, say, linear functions. Linear functions from n dimensions to m dimensions over all distributions. And okay, so again, there are many, many degrees of freedom in this model. So you've got n inputs, which are protein concentrations. M separate outputs, expression levels of, the n inputs are some way of expressing your environment. The m outputs are proteins that you express. You need to figure out how to express them. There's, again, for each of these outputs, there's an arbitrary function in this class that's a low-degree polynomial that specifies the ideal input-output relation. So again, we're quantifying over all of these. We're also quantifying over all distributions D in n-dimensional space. And this distribution, again, represents the examples that nature presents you. And again, a loss function, which given how you've responded and how the ideal function would respond, gives you some penalty for responding differently from it. And for now, it's the distance squared, but later we'll talk about any convex function. And again, the goal is to win the evolution game in all cases. So we're quantifying over all these things. And half the audience I know is going to say, look, you've got too many cases, nature isn't this general, I only care about this case. Can you do this case? Can you solve this specific case? I don't want to know about the typical case, I want to know about this case. Half the audience is going to say, no, this isn't enough quantification, I want to know about quantification over all possible feedback that the creature can give the environment and all possible. I mean, there's many, many things you can add to this.
And presumably, you shouldn't just be dividing the audience into halves.
No, okay.
There are other views which...
Two-thirds of the audience is believing the first view, two-thirds is believing the second view, and there's an overlap between them.
No, I mean, there's ones who don't believe either, but believe that... Right.
So do you have any justification for convexity as opposed to a general polynomial time computable loss function? Because
I just don't know how to prove it for more general things, and for very non-convex things, it'll probably be impossible.
Yeah, but any justification for using?
If you're talking about vectors in high-dimensional space, distance functions like L2 or L1 are a natural thing to consider. No, if you've got some natural class of functions that you'd be interested in, then this is completely fair game. I just know how to prove it for
I guess
this.
the whole setup is in terms of polynomial time computability. So one could just talk about loss functions, which the only thing you know is polynomial time computable, right? As opposed to such strong assumptions like convexity.
Quantifying over the loss function is a little bit a separate issue because the loss function is more meant to represent kind of the laws of nature in some sense, physics almost. That it should be something simple and not, there's not necessarily a big computation happening there. Okay, that's an interesting point just beyond the scope of what I can prove today. Okay.
You kind of want to put all that into the functions, into the function space.
Great, yeah. So the place where we can easily deal with a lot of complexity is with these m arbitrary low-degree polynomial functions. Okay, so I just wanted to philosophically try and defend one kind of philosophical point from computer science that, again, a good portion of the audience, you'll have to forgive me for going through this, but I think it might be relevant to some of the rest of the audience. Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's play a very silly game called Guess My Password. So, okay. What is my password? Okay, this is my password. Let's play the Guess My Password game. Can anyone guess my password? How hard is it to guess my password?
It's pretty easy.
It's pretty easy. Well, look, I picked a really good password. Like, anyone will tell you this is a really good password. How hard is it to guess my password? Okay, well, maybe the problem is that we don't have enough data, okay? So maybe I should collect some more data, okay? So instead of this, imagine some list of kind of 100 passwords like this. Okay, so I've gone out into the lab and collected a lot of data. So now I have 100 pieces of data. So now I have a list of 100 actual passwords that are, real passwords. How hard is it to guess my password? Well, now things are a bit more complicated. Now you only know that it's 1 out of a list of 100 things. So your probability of guessing my password is 1 out of 100. But still, this really isn't modeling what's going on. If something like this is my password, then it should be pretty hard to guess. So this is where computer scientists, where we're forced to, instead of looking at specific data, we talk about a model of generating passwords. So consider a model of generating passwords where I have, say, a 10,000 word dictionary, very, very simple words, and I just pick 2 random words from this dictionary and concatenate them. House, elephant. Okay? So this is a generative model for passwords. And given this, how hard is it to guess my password? If I've generated a password from this model, I choose 1 word from this 10,000 word dictionary and a second word from this 10,000 word dictionary and concatenate them. How hard is it to guess my password?
Impossible. 1 in 10 to the minus 8.
1 in 10 to the minus 8, okay? 1 in 10,000 times 1 in 10,000. So even though, this isn't exactly how I generate my password, I don't exactly go to a dictionary and do this. I do something, a bit stranger. Maybe I add 1, 2, 3 at the end. If we have a generative model, that's not quite capturing the exact truth. It doesn't agree with the data. This is the data. This is our model. It's not the exact thing. But somehow having a model that's big enough, that generates things, even things that we're not likely to ever see, even things that we've never seen. This gives us insight into how hard the problem is how hard these computational problems we're solving are. So this is the challenge here. So even though there are specific examples of functions that we want to understand how they arose genetically, coming up with a simple model like this, house elephant model, and trying to ask how hard are these things to evolve. This gives us much more insight than taking a specific thing and saying, look, I just want to guess this password. How hard is it to guess this password? Sorry, there's a question?
Yeah, I really do want to delay answering this, but I'm deeply confused by the question. Most hard problems biology never solves. Almost certainly biology never solves most hard problems that exist. It solves some hard problems, but that's a very different question from asking if it solves a particular hard problem.
So, I mean, again, think of these fish that appear in these mountain lakes. So, fish don't solve every hard problem, but they solve enough interesting problems that we need a general explanation for how fish can solve problems.
It's still very different to look at.
Yeah. No, this is a very important point.
I mean, suppose this is my naive, non-computer science way of thinking about it, so I probably will say something silly, but suppose that there's a huge number of hard problems, and the probability of solving any hard problem is some small number, close to 0, but the number of hard problems is the inverse of that probability. Then biology solves hard problems with a probability of 1, but it solves any particular hard problem with a probability of 0.
Sure.
So I'm just puzzled by the way you're framing it, because I mean, it's an interesting problem. I can see that.
Yeah. So I mean, again, you can talk about this with respect to the password guessing game. That maybe some passwords are harder to guess than others.
No, in biology, if there's a password and it's hard to guess, then it'll probably never be guessed. But organisms will be fine.
Or it'll do like people do if they hack into biology would hack into the computer and get it from one of the means. I mean, I think.
Supposing I happen to guess someone in the audience's password, okay?
Or just how far into your talk are you?
I'll end in 5 minutes.
We call this discussion. So,
yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Great. Yes. I don't need to jump up and down about results. It's the model which I'm more interested in. So, yeah, I'm completely happy just ending here and discussing. Yeah. Supposing I happen to guess someone in the audience's password. Okay. Supposing I actually claim that I actually know someone in the audience's password. What do you guys conclude?
You got lucky.
That somebody in the audience has a really bad password.
Or maybe I happen to know someone in the audience. They told me their password, or
the computer.
right, if we've got this phenomenon that on the surface seems very hard to do, and then I tell you that actually I can do it, immediately there are sort of 4 different possibilities for how to get around this hardness result. And it's the same kind of thing here. That if there's a phenomenon which is hard to do, evolving some specific behavior, then immediately what everyone should think about is what are the explanations that get around the hardness results. We need some explanation for this miracle.
Maybe in the course of your lifetime you've faced an infinite number of hard problems, and now you're picking the one that you happen to have solved.
Okay, so sorry, I really love this. So maybe over the course of my lifetime I've used 20 passwords, and then someone randomly, a computer shows up in front of me and says, look, you need to log in using one of the 20 passwords you've already used. So again, this is me succeeding at a task that, if a computer appears in front of me and I manage to guess the password, again, you should be impressed, you should be looking for the explanation. One possible explanation is that it's a password I've already used. So this is an explanation for, say, how multicellularity has arisen in the lab. Well, multicellularity arose in the lab only because it arose in these creatures 500 million years ago and has been disabled and now re-enabled. So every time you see creatures succeeding at something, your instinct shouldn't be to say, well, it got lucky, but your instinct should be to say, well, how did it solve the password problem? Which of these kind of 5 ways around the hardness of guessing passwords did the creature use? Did it, was it an easy password? Was it a password it already knew in the past and had sort of half forgotten? Was it a password that, a friend of it, a password of a friend of it that, its friend communicated to it?
But this is a coincidence problem, right? And I think if you extend this, you just say, okay, you're very impressed by having solved that problem. But if you ask, how many other problems are there which you would have been equally impressed if it had solved?
But you failed to solve.
Right, and you only find the one that happened to have solved one which you're impressed by, right? That's the paradox of evolvability, that it's conditioning upon what we actually see and things being successful. And then it always looks as if you have something very impressive if you get something which is conditioning upon a bunch of rare events.
Right. So I mean, another aspect of this, which I think is worth considering, is in some sense evolvability is talking about what happens in a fixed environment. What kind of behavior can arise in a fixed environment? And if you find behavior that seems more complicated than can arise in a fixed environment, for example, a parity function of many bits, the conclusion is not, oh no, you cheated, but perhaps this didn't arise in a fixed environment. Perhaps nature somehow led it step by step to evolve each component of this parity function.
Let me try to say it a different way.
Yeah.
Suppose that I get 10 to the 8th guesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I,
For a password.
and then, right, and the password is in a space that's of complexity 10 to the 8th.
Yeah.
And then I happen to guess right. How impressed are you?
He's on the internet. There could be, almost 10 to the 10th people in the audience,
Can you
right?
finish
You
your
get
thought?
100 passwords.
I mean, the organisms face a huge number of hard problems, and they don't solve almost all of them.
So it's not necessarily that you went in and logged in and guessed somebody's password, but the fact that somebody did that, if there are 10 to the 8 people.
So if you're bringing my number of guesses up, so look, with passwords, the number of guesses I have patience for is kind of 50, and the space is 10 to the 8, so okay.
Yeah,
but if you want to give me 10 to the 8 guesses, then you need to give me a space of 10 to the 1 billion genes. Sorry, 10 to the 1 billion genomes of length, a few billion. Okay,
No,
if I 10 to the 8 guesses,
it's an
then
environmental complexity problem. It's not a genome complexity problem.
no, I need to get the
poses-
gene that solves the problem.
Now, if the
No, I
environment
don't-
poses a huge number of hard problems, and an organism happens to solve one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so look, if you raise the numbers from 50 guesses and 10 to the 8 passwords to 10 to the 50 guesses, I don't even care what this number is, and a password space of 10 to 1 billion, the problem only gets more strange. That every time you succeed, your instinct shouldn't be, well, look, I don't want to explain this because there were a lot of guesses. Your instinct should be, look, it has to have gotten very kind of fortunate. It has to have gotten some strong hint somehow. It has to have had strong help somehow. What are the avenues that it could have gotten strong help by?
I think, wait, so they're not trying to increase the number of guesses that you get, right? That you said you know the password of someone in the audience. They're trying to increase the number of audience members.
Yeah,
I think the point is the same, but just
yeah.
to, I think you guys will talk to each other better if you do the same.
Okay, so someone asked me to finish my talk, so I guess I'll just skip to maybe
Can
one
you put
of
the further directions there?
okay, sure. Okay, there's a gap between what we can prove via natural-sounding evolution algorithms, so namely like make mutations randomly in random bits, versus artificial things. So if you allow an arbitrary Turing machine to run on your genes, what can it do? There's a gap between these, and understanding how to get more natural-like things to succeed in more cases. This is compelling. There's questions about whether these natural algorithms can be extended to more general loss functions beyond L2. And there's a very interesting connection between what evolution seems to do, at least in simulations, and aspects of optimization that we don't understand. So things like simulated annealing, where the ball doesn't always roll downhill, it sometimes goes uphill a little bit, and it somehow ingeniously succeeds in cases that rolling downhill won't succeed at. So evolution succeeds in somehow the same way, and understanding exactly how evolution succeeds in cases like this, I think, might shed insight on simulated annealing. And again, just a kind of big picture thing. So, I think we've discussed this. I guess there's this phrase coined at Berkeley, the computational lens. What does the world look like through a computational lens? So I just had this slide here. So if you look at evolution, in some sense, what I'm talking about today, and almost the only thing we know how to talk about is microevolution, the very short time scale evolution. So if you look very closely at a squirrel's DNA, you might catch it evolving. So some T changes to a C. And in some sense, this is very similar to it. If you look at the computer closely enough, really closely, you can catch it maybe with an instruction like register 2 becomes register 1 plus 7. And somehow this doesn't capture what's happening on your laptop. The magic of your laptop is not captured by addition. The magic really is how do these local pieces fit together into a much bigger whole? And this is a very different kind of question to ask. In some sense, this evolvability thing is trying to talk about what can you do in one step? What's the kind of evolutionary analog of addition? And really scrutinizing what's happening with addition is not the right thing to do. The right thing to do is ask, how do the bigger pieces fit together and what's surprising? What surprises us? figuring out exactly if you can do addition or addition and multiplication in one step. This is not what differentiates an impressive computer from a not impressive computer. The real question is how these pieces fit together in context, which is just a much broader thing, which I'm interested in general. Okay, so I'll end here. Thanks.
One of the things that I'm confused about and worries me is that unless your model is meant to be a kind of null model, that it might underestimate the class of problems that biological evolution can solve, because biological evolution is capable of, for example, the evolution of evolvability, so aspects of learning that you excluded from the evolution model seem to be the most interesting things about evolution that we're trying to discover. So can you just...
Right. So this model is trying to model what you can learn in one step with a fixed environment. And people who have seen a reasonable amount of machine learning in the audience will know that, by analogy, in machine learning, what you can learn just given a fixed environment, in some sense, is really limited. And in some sense, the big punchline of machine learning is that, well, after we've proven all these really distressing upper bounds, saying that, well, machine learning actually can't do any of the interesting things that we can do. There are theorems out there saying that all the tasks that we can do are actually impossible to learn. So the mystery is, well, how do we learn them? And in some sense, the answer is, well, we got teachers. So you can't learn anything interesting in one step, but in multiple steps, given the right guidance, given someone leading you along this path, you can learn anything. But in one step, there's very little you can learn. So this is in some sense the tension here, that anything which is, any of the really impressive things that life does have to have happened in multiple steps. And again, this is the analogy with if you see the fish at the top of a waterfall, they couldn't have gotten there in one jump. And this makes you look for alternative explanations.
I thought your model had multiple steps.
Multiple generations, but the environment doesn't change.
The environment. That
Yeah.
doesn't answer my question.
Yeah.
Just, one comment on the question about the fish one and some analogy there.
Yeah.
That you're focusing down there, you're saying, okay, I can understand this, but I can understand this bit, and one then focusing down on the bit that one should be really surprised by. Maybe be really surprised by. And that seems to me an important part, is that if you're getting an understanding of which things that may be surprising, one can evolve easily, then one can go and focus on, okay, which bits are the most surprising if I can understand those. And I think it makes that point. The other thing is you said you would say something about the random case versus the worst case. I think you did.
Yeah, sorry. So that was this password thing. That this is kind of a typical password, but scrutinizing this typical password in detail somehow doesn't even tell you about the general problem of all passwords. And to talk about the general problem of how surprising guessing a password is in general, you need to talk about some model for how passwords came to arise. And this dictionary model is a model, which doesn't fit the specific data, which doesn't fit the case that you specifically care about, but somehow gives you insight into it anyway.
Or the sort of ensemble of how people behave when they're picking passwords.
Right. Which is really hard to model specifically, yeah. Like the ensemble of behavior that people do when picking passwords. This is analogous to the ensemble of crazy things that life does. You are never going to model every detail of this. There's no hope of it. But you can capture at least something about the hardness or easiness of guessing passwords by just, drastically simplifying things, and you'll still get some insight.
So, for example, I wouldn't choose to guess a computer scientist's password. I would choose to guess some other kind of person's password.
Oh, yes. So I think I'll end here. So thank you.